Hi, everyone. It's Andrew Walsh, author of Lost Dayton, Ohio, and writer for my website, Dayton Vistas. So, one of the common themes in my book is the Great Flood of 1913, which wreaked havoc on the core of Dayton and devastated many of the sites I explore in the book. But the tragic story also includes some inspiring examples of how the Dayton community rallied together and also rebuilt for a new era. Right now, it's the time in late March when the flood struck, so I thought I'd make a quick video about it. I've selected a series of images that I think help tell larger stories about not just the flood itself, but also Dayton's history and trajectory as a city. The flood is still the greatest natural disaster in Ohio history. Beginning on March 21st, 1913, 3 days of late winter rainstorms caused the Great Miami River to overflow. The levees failed, sending floodwaters rampaging through the city. Up to 20 feet of water covered downtown, forcing residents up to rooftops and to the upper floors of commercial buildings. Here's an amazing image that depicts Newcomb's Tavern, located where the water first invaded the downtown district, which is around Main Street and today's Monument Ave. This was where spectators watched the water until it reached their knees. Built in 1796, Newcomb Tavern is Dayton's earliest building that still survives, and it also served as our first jail, church, and even general store. It's a miracle it wasn't swept away in the floodwaters, given the water level and its location. Newcomb's Tavern is now located at Carillon Historical Park. The flood was devastating in many ways. It ripped many houses from their foundations and completely destroyed houses, barns, outbuildings, and much more in a wide radius out from the center of the city. Back downtown, this image depicts the Leonard Building on Main Street, which collapsed completely due to the impact of the floodwaters. And here's the beautiful building from the cover of my book, Steele High School, after the flood took out one of its turrets. Here's the scene in the reference room of Dayton's public library, which is an extra sad sight for me as I'm a librarian as well. And the flood was also crippling to many Dayton businesses. So one of them was Dayton's most beloved downtown retail store, Reich's, which had only just opened in 1912. And the store is pictured here on the left. During the flood, 8 feet of water swept into the store, and it destroyed the whole first floor and all of its merchandise. This naturally led to financial ruin, and Reich's faced bankruptcy. Here's a picture of the cleanup efforts at the store. Frederick Reich, then the owner, set an example for employees by personally shoveling mud out of his store. And although at the time he couldn't get a loan from a local bank, he was persistent and eventually succeeded in getting a loan from the Hathaway Company in New York City, which was on the basis of personal reputation rather than any faith in his company. But ultimately, his business would recover decisively. The flood also stranded 250 people in the Dayton Arcade, which hadn't even been open a full decade when the disaster hit. It suffered major damage, but perhaps even more damaging was the fact that fear of floodwaters would cause many of Dayton's prominent downtown residents to move to streetcar suburbs like Dayton View that sat on higher elevation. That meant less foot traffic for arcade merchants and struggles that would last much longer than the flood cleanup. But a dedicated group of shoppers and supporters was always there to help steer the arcade through tough times, and that's remained the case to this day with its recent major redevelopment. One block west of the arcade at the Algonquin Hotel, which is more recently the Dayton Grand and the Doubletree, 300 guests were stranded when the flood hit. But they ended up getting lucky as quick thinking staff moved supplies onto higher floors as the water rose. And one source said these guests were probably the only people downtown who were served regular meals during the ordeal. The effect of the flood on Dayton's most prominent company, NCR, or National Cash Register, was a little more complex. In fact, some say it may have actually saved the company. Prior to the flood, the company was in a precarious legal situation due to its ruthless tactics to stifle competition. And in 1912, federal authorities had indicted 30 officials, including founder John H. Patterson and Edward Deeds, for violating the Sherman Antitrust Act. They would actually be sentenced to 1 year in prison, but the company's heroic rescue efforts during the flood swayed public opinion and likely played some role in those charges being dropped on appeal. In the aftermath of the flood, NCR's factory buildings were transformed into places of refuge. Workers served meals to the hungry, and a tent city was set up for those displaced. This shows the emergency headquarters at NCR, and you can see signs for where the nurses and doctors could report for duty. And then here's an image of those tents that were set up for flood refugees. Patterson also directed NCR to build 275 rescue boats, and he sent employees out to save stranded Daytonians and take them to safety. One worker saved 100 people single-handedly, and Patterson, who was 68 at the time, even joined the efforts himself. Here's an image from some of those boat rescues around town, and note the high water mark that you can see on the houses in the background. Elsewhere in town, fire was the more damaging force than water on a busy stretch of East 3rd Street. So the Burkhart and Rotterman drugstore was located on the northwest corner of 3rd and St. Clair, and it burst into flames after a gas explosion. The fire quickly spread through the block, and burning material floated through the missing window of the Lowe Brothers paint store. And when spilled paint caught fire, flames grew and eventually swallowed the entire block, which consisted of vulnerable wood frame buildings. The impact was tremendous, but Dayton quickly responded by building new structures which utilized brick and new fireproof construction methods, and the area was eventually given a name that reflected this history and rebirth, the fire blocks. So the flood impact, cleanup, and subsequent rebuilding were a major undertaking, and I've only scratched the surface here. But in my book, I also cover how many of these sites fared in the later decades of the century, covering themes like deindustrialization, suburban flight, and urban renewal. And the fire blocks is one of the areas of downtown that declined in the later decades of the 20th century and was largely vacant just a few years ago. So a major redevelopment has brought back apartments, restaurants, and even retail shops to this block. And I like to think that all the efforts going on right now to revitalize our city are channeling some of the spirit that helped Dayton bounce back from this historic flood. So that's it for today, but be sure to subscribe as I have a lot more videos planned. And in the meantime, you can head over to my website, DaytonVistas.com, for more flood content, including some maps showing how far the floodwaters spread. And you can also join my email newsletter to be notified of my latest writing. Thanks, everyone.